The UK's uplands need urgent reform.
The evidence here. Really important we do look at the evidence.
This has had a huge amount of abuse, speaking out on these issues.
To just kill all the grouse would mean there'd be no grouse next year.
And don't move through motive arguments.
Driven grouse shooting produces a very unhealthy landscape.
Shooting is part of the environmental
They're
process.
at risk of becoming ecological deserts. Grouse shooting needs to change.
Driven grouse shooting can be a very emotive subject. So what we've been at pains to do is to be as objective as possible and always collect the scientific evidence and evaluate it objectively. That's very, very important because that is the way that we get the big picture that I alluded to in terms of economic, social and environmental use of this very, very important part of our heritage and land in this country. And I think that'll be very important for dispelling any negative feelings for the way that uplands are developed in the future. I was appointed because I'm truly objective as regards driven grouse shooting. I don't shoot grouse. I have no personal interest in upland development. I have never been involved in any emotional or political element regarding driven grouse shooting.
This report, Sustainable Grouse Shooting, results from a research project that a colleague and I did. Our task was to examine all the relevant literature looking at the three key areas of sustainability: economic, social and environmental / ecological. And we had to examine the literature, I think, with a degree of care and caution, because what we wanted was really gold standard evidence, really good methodology, and the findings were defendable and potentially replicable. A key part of the review was not just to look at whether grouse shooting as an activity is sustainable, but to compare that activity with the alternative uses of moorland that people suggest. And I think our findings are interesting. Certainly I was surprised by some of them.
So a very good definition of sustainability is that it's a long-term goal to achieve a more sustainable world. Sustainable development, on the other hand, refers to the many processes and practices that are there in order to get to that goal. For example, sustainable agriculture, forestry, management, production, consumption, good government, and of course good governance is very important. Also education and training, absolutely vital. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has developed a very good core mainstream thought on what this is. It's underpinned by three major elements: the economic, the social and the environmental. And it's those three key elements which underpin sustainability globally and also underpin the core of this report.
So if we look at a couple of examples of the social impacts of driven grouse shooting that we found. Obviously with driven grouse shooting there are people called beaters whose job it is to move the grouse towards the people shooting the guns, who are sheltering in their butts waiting for the grouse to appear. Now these beaters are not shooting. They're typically people from the local area, although sometimes we get examples of people travelling 50, 60 miles to beat. And they're walking along and they're doing as much as 15 to 20 miles a day. Now the government values exercise. Those beaters who are over 45 is costed at £1,966 per year per person. If you look at the numbers of people who are beating times one number by the other, you find suddenly there is this social impact worth millions of pounds. Any attempt to move away from grouse shooting towards an alternative use does need to look at these social impacts. They're incredibly important and valuable. Loneliness. We know from our project. Not everybody, but some of the people who are beating are actually quite lonely, and loneliness in upland communities is a problem. The cost of loneliness, according to the government, is about £6,000 to the health service over a 10-year period. So imagine you're over 45 and lonely because you're widowed or divorced or something. You've got £1,966 worth of exercise and you're reducing the cost of loneliness. You can't say everybody going out benefits to this amount and the country saves this amount of money, but what you can say is there is a real economic value in the social impacts of participation in driven grouse shooting as a beater, and do the alternative uses deliver the same value? The evidence at the moment says no.
It's amazing the sort of sense of camaraderie and community that you have amongst the shooting community. We have guys up into the 80s that are shooting with us still, who obviously we have to tailor the day so that they don't have to do quite as much physical side of it. It gives the old boys a chance to actually get up and still carry on with the sport that they enjoy. Such a huge age range of people. It's so nice that a big social group get together with mixed ages. There's probably not that many sports that you can have such a huge age range of participation and everybody's sort of on a level playing field, if you like.
I've seen people come and enjoy themselves so much. It's just unbelievable. Helps with people to get the minds off the problems that the whole country, well no, the whole world's in. Shooting is a big part of a lot of people's lives. It's massive, and if it wasn't there, you would have a big mental health problem, because that's all they look forward to, and that's a lot of people, that's all they do.
If you consider that the majority of people who shoot or beat on the moor are men, and mental health awareness for men at the moment is more prominent than it ever has been, getting out in the fresh air and doing things with nature, with the daylight, with the sunlight, even in the rain, it's got such a sense of belonging, a sense of being needed.
And there's also some very interesting work that has been reported to the Scottish Government and included in the liability report, pointing out that for many remote communities in the Highlands, grouse shooting and driven grouse shooting is part of this cultural web of activities and is very significant for the community. It is a key force that binds the community together. And delivers a range of benefits along the lines I've talked about earlier in terms of reducing loneliness, etc.
I'm part of a wider moorland community. I couldn't name what I'd be doing if I wasn't a gamekeeper. Driven grouse shooting gives us work in rural environments that need jobs. I've heard many options for other ways we can use them, or as money coming in through wildlife tourism. But nothing's going to create this amount of jobs, this community, and keep this habitat looking this beautiful.
It would cost the public an awful lot of money. All the gamekeepers, the underkeepers and all that would be made unemployed. So they would have to be on the dole. They would lose a house because the house is usually with the job, and then they would have to be rehoused. And all that money for them people would have to come out of the government and the taxes that we pay. And people don't realise just what that would mean to the whole community.
It takes all these little drops of water to fill the big puddle up that people rely on as money and their income. It makes a big difference to a lot of local people who don't actually shoot at all, but it plays a huge part of their working life and their businesses every year. And without it, no doubt everybody would suffer.
If we turn to the economic impacts of driven grouse shooting, again, I think there are some quite interesting findings. Let's look at tourism. The North York Moors National Park website points out that in 2018, 8.4 million people visited just that relatively discrete area of the North York Moors. The National Park valued the expenditure at about £730 million and estimated that it resulted in 11,300 people being employed. Now, these are very significant numbers for what is actually quite a small area. The National Park do surveys on why people visit the North York Moors and what they think of it. 95% of them came back and said, well, we love the environment, we like the rolling purple moorland, we think it's a really nice place. And then you dig deeper, and 80 to 85%, it's not an exact figure, but it's somewhere between 80 and 85% of the North York Moors has driven grouse shooting taken place over it. That's astonishing. The North York Moors doesn't look like it is because of accident. It looks like it is because of driven grouse shooting. Driven grouse shooting doesn't just have the simple economic benefit of somebody spends X £1,000 in order to shoot grouse and they stay in a local hotel and they go to the local garage, etc. All these things are important, but that's just the obvious expenditure. The impact on the economic impact of grouse shooting, you've got to look at tourism, and in some areas, I think particularly the North York Moors, it's incredibly important.
My name is Charles Cody. I've got the Charles Bathurst Inn, known locally as the CB Inn. I've had that for 25 years. And also the Punch Bowl in Low Row. They're both accommodation and food-led businesses. What drives the business in this area is accommodation, of which shooting is an important part. But more importantly, the estates in the area provide an essential maintenance and care for the environment, the dales, the quality of the moorland, pathways and so on. And without them, this area would be scrubland. There'd be no nesting birds, no curlews, no grouse. That is a significant element of our guests' interest in coming up to this area.
Good morning, my name's Simon Fennick. Welcome to Gilson's of Yorkshire, and this is our gun room. We wouldn't be in the position we are today without driven grouse shooting. It has enabled us to grow the family business over 35 years to where we are today in this fantastic purpose-built building just off Scotch Corner. Due to driven grouse shooting and the income it has provided us over the years, we've been able to reinvest in the business. We now employ 10 people. Obviously them 10 people have families to look after, and we're growing all the time. So as long as driven grouse shooting continues, the business will grow, and hopefully we'll employ a lot more people in the future, and it will be here for the fourth generation of people to run the business.
I think another impact of the economics of driven grouse shooting that people probably don't consider is the amount of money that's spent with contractors. And this is both internal contractors, carpenters, etc., because all the buildings which are used for grouse shooting or for accommodation need maintaining. But the outdoor contractors, their role is very interesting. And yes, there are the obvious things. They do build or repair butts, but they make quite a lot of tracks. Now, these tracks are not just for grouse shooting because they're there all year round, and these tracks permit access and thus enable tourism. So there's a sort of an interesting virtuous circle between the work of an outdoor contractor, which also facilitates tourism. The other big work that external contractors doing is moorland restoration, particularly around peatland restoration. Contractors are a good example of how moorland management for grouse shooting is not simplistic. It's not we just have grouse on this moor and that's it. It's really quite an integrated and complex web of economic activities which lead to a whole variety of direct benefits clearly for grouse shooting, but if you like downstream benefits for society, tourists, etc.
Without driven shooting, I don't know what I'd do. It plays a big part in my life. It brings a lot of income in alongside my business. Everyone else in the area and the community would suffer hugely without the driven shooting. We rely on it a lot. Restaurants, petrol stations, your bakeries, your hotels, your B&Bs, like they house so many of the chaps that come in and shoot. Those guys spend a lot of money around here, not just on shooting, but like, you know, in the pubs, the restaurants, pay our wages, like we'd be lost without it.
When we looked at the evidence for the economic and environmental sustainability of driven grouse shooting, I think we were struck by the fact that there is in fact there's a global context in which we need to look at British moorlands and indeed the grouse. Our moorlands are internationally extremely rare. We have most of the upland heather moorland in the world. It is a pretty unique environment. And of course the red grouse is one of the only 7 endemic species of bird that we have in the UK. And they're not found anywhere else. They're a relative of the willow grouse found in Scandinavia and other parts of the world, but the red grouse itself is pretty unique. So you've got a unique, internationally, a globally unique environment and unique bird, and we're lucky enough to have them in this country.
The conservation work that we do benefits the moor tenfold and helps to increase the plants, animals and invertebrates that live here and make them more beautiful. That brings in thousands of tourists every year. To keep these moors beautiful and teeming with wildlife, we carry out basic moorland management. One method of that is controlled burning. That is clearing the top layer of heather to bring forward new shoots and new growth that not only provide nesting habitat but also food for ground nesting birds, which include red grouse and rare species like lapwing and curlew, which are in decline.
When we looked at the evidence on the ecological and environmental impacts of driven grouse shooting, again compared with alternative uses of moorland, we were forced to look at what's called natural capital and ecosystem services. And what this essentially means is air quality, water quality and reduction of emissions of globally warming gases, carbon and methane. And in practical terms, what policymakers and practitioners are interested in are air, water and carbon. And air, that leads us on to burning. Now there is a lot of heat generated by the debate around burning, and there have been questions asked in Parliament and petitions against burning on moorland. But burning, of course, is not just, it's not a simple subject, and it's not a recent thing, and importantly, burning is not something that arose with grouse moor management. If we go back into the history, as we've had to on this project, in the early 19th century, when the Scottish landowners were beginning to realise how much money they could make from luring the English upper classes north to shoot grouse, they actually worked hard with the local farmers to reduce the amount of burning that the farmers were doing on the moors, because it was producing a monoculture of vegetation all the same age, all the same height, and this was not good for grouse. And the landowners very quickly realised that there was more money to be made from grouse than sheep. So burning is not just something associated with grouse moor management. In fact, grouse moor management in Scotland in the 18th century resulted in less burning than previously had been practised. And burning also needs to be looked at in terms of controlled burning, deliberate burning, in order to manage the height and age of vegetation, and uncontrolled burning, wildfires. And I think the evidence is absolutely clear. What must be avoided at all cost, if possible, is wildfires, because a wildfire burns really at very high temperatures, gets through the vegetation into the peat, and then that can burn and release vast amounts of carbon. These fires are capable of burning for days and destroying vast areas of land and all types of animals and plants. They're the ones to be avoided. Controlled burning is a very different subject.
You might have seen wildfires on TV, but when you're there in the moment, it's times like that where the community band together. Farmers, landowners, gamekeepers from neighbouring estates, we've all got firefighting equipment that's paid for by driven grouse shooting. Our time and our effort is paid for by driven grouse shooting. It can be an absolute disaster, not only for the wildlife that lives there, but for the carbon. You can see on unmanaged moors where grouse shooting does not take place, and there's no money to pay for land managers like me that can go out in the middle of the night and put a wildfire out and use our extensive knowledge and equipment that we use for controlled burning. There's nothing left.
What the literature shows is that if you want maximum biodiversity on an area of moorland, you need a mosaic landscape. And by mosaic landscape, I mean different heights, types and ages of vegetation. And it's that mosaic that provides the best environment for mammals, invertebrate, birds, etc. If you manage the land all in the same way, and planted all with trees, etc., or you let it all go wild, obviously if you let it go wild you increase the risk of wildfire enormously, but if you move away from that mosaic, you move away from biodiversity. Biodiversity is important to this country, we value it, the government values it, policymakers, practitioners value it. If we want biodiversity, the literature strongly indicates that you need this mosaic.
If grouse shooting was banned today, my personal opinion is there would be no grouse in 10 years. And the moors would just be a wasteland. There'd be no wildlife up there, only the vermin, if there was any vermin. They wouldn't have anything to eat. It's been managed for hundreds and hundreds of years.
What people don't realise is how harsh an environment that actually is in the winter time, and without having the good summers and the benefit of the pest control and stuff through the summer, a lot of things would really struggle to make it through the winter. We had the beast in the east 3 years ago that was would have decimated a lot of things up there. A lot of stuff wouldn't recover if it wasn't for the fact that they had a good environment to go back to that had a lower natural level of predators and predation, and it just lets everything have a good chance. So not only did the grouse get the help, but also all the other birds and small mammals and stuff get the help as well from that and the benefit from it.
As we know, we're in this global environment where climate is changing. We are getting warmer as a planet. Carbon sequestration, carbon emissions and methane, I don't think enough attention is given to methane. These are increasingly important. So it was important that we looked at the literature around carbon emissions and sequestration from moorland currently used for some form of grouse shooting, and compare it with the literature for other potential uses of moorland. And I think the first thing to say is the literature is not complete. There is no league table that conveniently says, well, grouse shooting produces a landscape with this amount of carbon emission and sequestration, whereas forestry produces that. But individual studies show, for example, that planting a wood, even a broadleaf wood, is likely to result in more carbon emission than having a properly managed moorland, which includes grouse shooting as well as other activities. There is currently no evidence to suggest that alternative uses of moorland will release less or store more carbon than current practices, if anything, quite the reverse. I think if I had to sum up our 243-page report, driven grouse shooting doesn't take place in isolation. It is part of a complex web of integrated activities, and it is these integrated activities that result in economic, social and environmental impacts. And in many cases these impacts have positive benefits that can be increasingly costed, both on individuals and society. When we look at the literature and consider the evidence for alternative uses of moorland, and the literature is always imperfect, scientists always want more science, but when you look at the literature, there is currently no evidence that alternative uses of moorland would deliver the same levels of benefit. In fact, my conclusion is that the economic, social and environmental impacts would be more negative than the current uses of the moor. In short, when driven grouse shooting is done properly as part of this integrated web, we believe it is sustainable.
So we've collected an enormous amount of evidence in this report. In fact, over 10% of the pages detail the scientific and other papers which have led to the writing and the evaluation that the report has undergone. We've looked at all sides of an argument in an attempt to be as objective as possible and to remove any emotional and political elements which driven grouse shooting has in the past engendered. We feel that the report will be very important in making sure that negative environmental, economic and social impacts will not be used in this important part of our land and our heritage. Despite, or indeed perhaps because of, our research-led approach, we know that there are many areas where there is just not enough research, where we need more research, and these are highlighted in the report. That means that this report will in fact become a living document. When new evidence comes to light, it will be updated. So we hope that this report will become a key go-to document, not only for people who are interested in driven grouse shooting, not only for policymakers, whether locally or nationally, but for anyone who cares about the sustainable development of our rural communities and of the people that they serve.